Hello one and all, and welcome back to another Kerbal Space Program video. And for today's Kerbal Space Program video, we will be continuing the sort of theme I've been running with on this channel for the past few weeks, and that is servicing and sorting out the various space stations I've got in low Kerbin orbit. If you can stretch your minds back all the way to the ancient era of January the 2nd, 2021, you may remember the mission in which I added a big double orange tank refuel tank to my Ferris gravity ring and refuel station, and during this mission I realised that the other refueling tanks on the Ferris station were pretty much depleted. One of the orange tanks was completely empty, while the other remaining orange tank was half full. So while it's not a completely urgent matter, since the station now has the new double orange fuel tank reserve that I added, it'd be nice to continue Lowne Aerospace with the knowledge that the refueling station is at full capacity. So in this video we'll be doing just that, heading off to the refueling Ferris station and replenishing the empty fuel tanks. I'm going to plop a link in the description if you want to see the previous video I did servicing this space station, where I added the big giant double orange tank extension. And you know, if you did miss it, then do consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss any further videos. Get that little plugged in. Anyway, going back to this mission, since the profile itself isn't anything too interesting, I decided to spice it up a little bit with what I consider to be a fairly interesting craft. It's this, a Skylon-inspired single stage to orbit with a cool, sleek shape that I obtained using the fairing pieces. Now I know it's kind of cheaty since it does use fuel tank clipping. However, I think this is kind of acceptable since A, the remaining empty space in the anterior and posterior fairings could theoretically house the fuel stored in the clipped parts of the tanks, and B, I'm using 4 of the giant delta wings, which I'm not adding any fuel to, despite their ability to store 300 units of liquid fuel each, so any further fuel that wouldn't reasonably fit into the empty space in the fairings could be stored there instead. I guess a final justification would be that we're not going to be using all the liquid fuel on board this vessel anyway, by quite a large margin in fact, because I wanted to give this spaceplane a little bit of extra delta V so that it can service space stations, or even surface bases maybe, at sites beyond low Kerbin orbit such as Minmus, Gilly, Mun, etc. So it does have an excessive amount of delta V in low Kerbin orbit for this particular mission. And speaking of this particular mission, we had now begun. It has begun. I nearly got a good transition there, didn't I? Now, because this SSTO is so aerodynamic and like pointy, I guess, which is actually a synonym for aerodynamic, except it's not. Doesn't matter. Anyway, I'm just saying this SSTO flies really, really well. It doesn't have very much drag, so it accelerates really, really nicely. You haven't got to spend time flying really, really close to sea level to get to that magical 440 meters per second to get those rapiers into their highest thrust mode, or, you know, just get the most thrust out of them. We could basically point straight towards, I don't know, for the angle of attack, I tried to aim for between 10 and 20 degrees, that sort of angle of attack. And from there, the spaceplane requires no further input, at least as far as pitch control is concerned. Like, you need to switch the rapiers and engage the nuclear engines, but other than that, the spaceplane pretty much flies itself. So about the 20-kilometer mark, I hit Action Group 3 to fire up the nuclear engines, and then, you know, a little bit later on, I pressed Action Group 2 to switch the mode of the rapiers into closed cycle burning so that we can get our way into space. Now, I had a quick look at the map screen just here and noticed that the target, not too far away from us, but it is slightly behind us. So I'm going to enter a slightly higher orbit than the space station at first, just to give the space station some time to catch up with us. A higher orbit is a slower orbit, and a lower orbit is a faster orbit. So if your target is behind you, entering a higher orbit at first gives that target enough time to catch up to you. And as you can see, we can get a fairly close separation pretty easily. I think in this case, I set my apoapsis to be 10 kilometers higher than the space station, which worked out pretty well. And we can go ahead and execute this burn. Do make sure that if you're flying this craft file that you can download in the description, by the way, make sure that you switch the Rapier engines back to air breathing mode once you've kind of run out of oxidizer. Not that you don't need to activate them or anything, but you may have noticed that the actual in-game Delta V readout, and indeed the burn time indicator, which to me is the bigger deal here, they don't really work too well. Like, they still take into account the Rapiers when working out your Delta V and estimated burn times, which obviously throws things way off when you're dealing with these slow, sluggish nuclear engines. So just make sure that you've converted the Rapiers back to air breathing mode rather than leaving them in closed cycle mode. Again, you can leave them deactivated, that's fine, but you just got to make sure that they're set to air breathing air breathing mode, basically. And hey, you'll need to do it anyway, right, when you do your re-entry, unless you can glide back to the Kerbal Space Center, like me in this video. But I know I'm not perfect. I sometimes overshoot or undershoot the Kerbal Space Center runway, so it is nice to have the air breathing engines to help get back to the Kerbal Space Center. So here we are performing our inclination adjustment burn to get our separation nice and slim. I think I initially got it to 0 kilometer separation, but then I kind of overshot a little bit, so it probably wasn't 0 kilometer separation. It was probably like half a kilometer, which, you know, 1 kilometer, half a kilometer, when you're dealing with this scale of things, it's not really a big deal. I tend to do my low curb in orbit dockings this way, where I get into an orbit that's got a somewhat close encounter, like, you know, within 10 kilometer separation, but I don't try and go for anything too close, because especially with a craft like this, which has terrible thrust to weight ratio, very rarely when you actually execute that maneuver node burn will you get that same separation. Usually you're way off anyway, so I just go for a rough encounter at first when I'm actually circularizing, because that's a really long burn, and then I perform a relatively smaller adjustment burn to get the actual encounter that I want. And then sometimes I need to do more than one of those as well. But in this case, I don't think I did. I wasn't paying that much attention to the screen, actually, whilst I was commentating just there, which is probably not very good, is it? But I don't think I had to do more than one little adjustment to get our close encounter, aside from obviously this last bit I just did here, where I just eyeballed it. I'm talking about on the map screen, creating maneuver nodes, etc. And now begins the very tedious process of lining this thing up to one of the docking ports on the space station. Now, I have a confession to make, guys. This was actually take 2. Like, my first attempt, this is highly embarrassing. My first attempt at this mission, I just put like an inline docking port on the top of the SSTO, and it would just dock like how you can see it docking here, except the docking port was, in line with those 2 massive engine clusters. And it was with, sinking realization that I got to the space station. When I tried to dock, literally the craft was too bulky to get close enough to the station to dock, and it's so cumbersome, and it doesn't really remove very quickly. It hasn't really got that much more repellent, and I just couldn't get it to like align properly and dock with the space station. I was very upset. It was a real pain, actually, to be honest, and it just doesn't really handle very well. I thought, you know what, I could just waste half my life trying to get this thing to very slowly align with the pitiful monopropellant reserves I have, or I could just go back to the drawing board quickly and add a little robot arm, and at the same time add loads more monopropellant. If you go back and watch the time lapse, you can see me build the whole SSTO. Then right before launch, I add lots more monopropellant tanks. That's how you know I've transitioned to Mark II of this vessel. I was making the improvements, and obviously this robot arm makes things dead easy for getting things lined up, because I know the robot arm can only bend, it can't rotate and angle itself like the Canadarm 2, for example, can on the International Space Station. But it's got a lot of flex and sway, so it kind of can angle itself a bit in a way. And there we are now docked. And I think it looks quite cool, actually. It looks like one of those in-flight refueling things that the army does, where there's like a jet fighter and it docks to a carrier aircraft via this sort of spindly wire thing. That was a horrible explanation, but it looks kind of like that, maybe, except not at all. And now we can begin the refueling process of the space station. Now, I don't know, actually, I thought I was about to say something there, but so it's only this fuel tank remaining, and we managed to have just enough fuel in this SSTO. I mean, it wasn't like a scary thing, right? I did actually check how much fuel we would need, and I brought just a little bit too much, actually. I thought it'd be cleaner just to have, full tanks in the SSTO's refueling capabilities rather than the exact quantity needed, because knowing me, I would mess it up and accidentally reduce the fuel levels by too much. So I thought, let's just keep it safe and clean and simple and have all of the fuel tanks there. So this SSTO is capable of carrying 1.5 full orange tanks. Though that being said, this is only what I've proven it to be able to do, and as you saw from, the earlier part of this video, it was really, really easy to fly, really, really easy to get into low Kerbal orbit, so I wouldn't be surprised at all if you were able to add a little bit more fuel reserves by adding an extra tank to its fuselage. So maybe that's something for the reader to try at home. I certainly can't be bothered right now, so we're just gonna go ahead and just fold in this robot arm. So yeah, I know I could have added like a, what's it called, a CAL, like a Kerbal. Basically, it was a forced acronym to make it sound like HAL from 2001: A Space Odyssey. You know, the Kerbal controller thing. I could have done that to have the actual robot arm extend and angle itself automatically, but who's really got time for that, guys? Not me. I've got things to do. Can't do it whilst I'm stuck in space, though, so let's try and get back to the runway. So I'm just going to time warp around so that the runway is on the daylight side of the planet, so you can actually see what's going on. Although, was a bit of a problem because I don't know if it was it last week's video or the week before? I think it was the week before, where my graphics mods haven't really updated too well to the latest version of Kerbal Space Program, version 1.11, and the ground on Kerbin, it glitches out. So I'll have to do a bit of a quick save and a quick load as we get close to the Kerbal Space Center, because you can't see the ground. The ground sort of disappears and goes all ghosty. You know, when you fall like through the bottom of a video game level. I think in Grand Theft Auto San Andreas this was called Blue Hell, so this is just what I referred to that now. Like when you fall through the bottom of a video game and you can look up and everything's blue, it's called Blue Hell. Bit of a weird, it looks like that anyway. Is this what this weird tangent is trying to demonstrate? Now here I'm going to quickly, in fact I've already done it actually, I deactivated the big SAS wheel at the back of the ship because we don't really need it for re-entry at this point, because the bulk of our controlling is going to be done using the control surfaces, and it just drains the batteries of this thing, and the RTG on board can't recharge the batteries fast enough. So if we use that SAS wheel at this point, not only are we using it unnecessarily because it's really not doing a great deal, it's going to just deplete our battery supply. So that's why I've disabled that reaction wheel. As we get close to the Kerbal Space Center's runway and we're gliding at a slightly more controllable speed, I will reactivate it again just to give us a slightly more control. I had to really stumble my way through that sentence. To give ourselves slightly more control during our final approach. But even then, it probably wasn't really that necessary. It was only because this thing handles terribly. It's very, very heavy, very, very slow. I mean, we've still got loads of fuel on board, and obviously it has a huge dry mass with those 3 nuclear engines and the 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 12 Rapier engines. So it's fairly heavy, fairly cumbersome. And in terms of a yaw control, we've only got that tiny little control surface at the back on the tail fin. That's the only thing that's doing our kind of yaw control, you know, our left and right. So this thing doesn't steer that well, was basically what I was trying to get at there. So the ground doesn't look too bad, but it will look worse and worse as we get closer and closer to it. So in just a second, there's going to be a really smooth transition where I make a quick save and then make a quick load, and then we'll just continue the flight like nothing happened. So again, if this happens to you and your ground glitches like this, you can just do that. I'm not sure which mod is causing it. I thought it would be Scatterer, and it might well be Scatterer, but I loaded the Scatterer options, and oh, here we go, creating the quick save. I loaded the Scatterer options and pressed refresh, like reload. It didn't do anything, so I'm not quite sure what's causing this problem. I'm gonna have to just bite the bullet and uninstall all of my mods and then go through and re-download them all. So maybe I'll try and get that done before next week's video if I remember. Usually I'll sit down, I'll make the craft, and then fly it, and then as I'm doing my final approach to the Kerbal Space Center, then I suddenly remember, like, oh yeah, I was meant to do that. Whoops. And that's what happened this time, guys. So make sure you donate to my Patreon. Thank you. Subscribe. If you did like this video, actually, do give it a like, because that does really help me. So that would be great if you did like it. Don't feel like obligated to. Now I'm just digging myself a hole, aren't I? There's other things as well in the description, like Instagram, Twitter, and now the craft has landed. And if you want to fly this craft yourself, you can go ahead and do that by downloading the craft file. Just be wary, actually, that I did mess up a bit with those front canards just there. They don't move because they're inside a fairing, so maybe just offset those so they're not inside that fairing. There's a thing I probably should have mentioned 13 minutes ago, but what are you going to do? It's the end of the video, and I guess that's it. If you want to see more videos like this one, then there is a link on screen now. Left-hand side is a link to a video chosen for you by YouTube's recommendation algorithm based on your previous viewing habits. Video on the right is my most recent upload. There's a link to subscribe and, you know, look at Patreon and stuff if you want. The description, you can buy my merch, my new Christmas line. I really like it. I thought it was good. And that's it. Goodbye.